I'm going to introduce our panel. Today the topic is why face-to-face. And before I do, I'm going to encourage you really to think about three things in today's session and tomorrow's session. Try to pick one key takeaway that you can apply to your business from QUAL360 this year. And then make sure that you make at least one new friend. And I don't mean just like at a cursory level, but like make it someplace in between, like an appropriate COVID level of relationship. And then the third thing is make sure you have fun. And to that end, our facial muscles and jowls start kicking in right around minute 10 of any Zoom call. So try to force yourself to find the joy in the process that we're all going through right now of learning and meeting new people. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's panel. Marcus Moldez, who is the qualitative UX research lead at Pinterest, Greg Park, the consumer insights analyst at Peapod Digital Labs, Hunter Cook, who we've seen a lot of today, shopper insights manager at Nestle, and Ben Jordan, associate director of the Human Insight Center of Excellence at Clorox, a brand that if you traveled, you saw a lot of in the last few hours. So anyway, thank you all very much for joining me. We're going to start out with a question. Qualitative research, completely disrupted. It's about a $6 to $8 billion space globally. 80% of that was in person pre-COVID. 100% of it went digital at COVID. Now it's shifting back. Is face-to-face important? Marcos, let's start with you.
Well, so I'm an anthropologist by training, so yes, TLDR, yes. I think it will continue to be important, but I think it'll be important in a different way and in more specific moments.
Hunter?
Yeah, I agree. I think the pandemic has shown that digital qual works and makes sense. But it depends on the context. I think for my role in shopper, getting that in-store, in-context exposure to what that shopper is going through and the decisions that they're making, hard to replicate that online, hard to be like, hey, actually go back and look at that display that you just walked by, and we made it work, but it was a challenge. But I think if the questions can be answered digitally and is able to scale that, I think that's definitely, both of them have a role moving forward.
So you see it as a mixed?
I do, yeah.
And then why invest in person then?
I think the context of where that decision is being made, if that is being more of an in-person versus like a digital, so online research versus, or online like product research or however that touch point of online, keeping that online makes sense, but then if that moment of truth is that in-person experience, getting that context of how that decision is being made makes a lot of sense.
All right, great.
Sure, so I think to echo what other folks have been saying, it definitely depends on context, depends on your industry, depends on your consumer, depends on your business question. In my role at PDL, doing consumer insights for 165 brick and mortar grocery stores, we're not selling a product, we're selling a place you go for a couple hours a week to buy groceries. So that's an experience, and that's, if you really want to understand that full experience, you need to have a live body in that store. You can show people pictures of decor and lighting, but they can't tell you that, well, I can smell the fish counter from the produce department, and that's kind of making it hard to shop for peppers, right? You can't do that unless you're actually in the physical space. Now, you might not be answering questions about a physical space, but I think, if you went all digital, you would lose so much of that.
And so from the CPG side, I think face-to-face qual research is going to go down significantly. I think online research has been a boom to processes and simplification, and the amount we're able to do, the diversity of people we're able to talk to. I clearly agree that there is a place for traditional and in-person research, but from our perspective, there's just a lot of use cases where online is working.
And I think all of us have had to adopt to online. How many of you have led IDIs and focus groups before? So almost everybody. I am curious from an audience perspective, how much value do you get out of not the interview? Meaning the conversation that happens either before or after the camera is turned off with the participant. Is there, just show of hands, a lot of value, right, in that sort of like outside of the edges piece. And I think that's one of the things that digital has, in a lot of ways, allowed us to continue to capture to some degree. If you are doing the back room, you can be done with the interview, but that whole thing still is kind of, you're having that conversation with the participant, so maybe there's opportunity to be able to capture that. But it is a, I miss the in-person. So my next question is overcoming the barriers of face-to-face research. I recently have been doing some report for another trade organization on trends, and I found it interesting that when comparing brand versus agencies, brands are 2 times more likely to find issues or barriers with doing face-to-face than their agency counterparts. What are some of the barriers that you see, and then are we ready to get back to face-to-face research? Hunter, let's start with you.
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think we're some of the initial barriers were just participant comfort levels and not wanting to expose people to situations that they weren't comfortable with, especially early in the pandemic. And as things have shifted and we're at sort of a different phase of where we are with COVID, I think people are starting to get more comfortable. I mean, this event is a good example of people starting to get back and feeling that comfort level of interacting face-to-face. But I think that sort of safety level was the biggest concern kind of early on with some of the in-person research.
Marcos?
A couple of things. I think how many people here, show of hands, are agency, and how many people, how many agency, like supplier side? Yeah, so you all know, like, it really comes down to, like, will the client go? And, like, you have no choice. So there's that. So, like, I sat on that side of the house, and now, let me tell you, the shit in the in-house, like, this Kool-Aid is delicious. You want to drink it. The challenge in-house, I think increasingly, at least on the tech side, in the sort of tech space, is we're increasingly remote or hybrid, and so your team is no longer all in the Bay Area, right? So you can't be like, right, everyone get in the car, we're going to Oakland, we're gonna go sit in someone's house and talk cheese or crackers or, you know, like condoms, whatever. Increasingly, you know, I now have a stakeholder in LA, I have one in Florida, I have one in Houston, so that presents a whole new set of challenges for getting people into the same room. But to something that Ben built on earlier, or said earlier, I feel like the online world also makes it possible to sort of engage with populations that were like very difficult to reach, to talk to, right? I'm thinking here specifically of like neurodiverse or neuroatypical communities for whom like face-to-face, like that is actually really hard. And so being able to kind of play to that, I think, is something that as an in-house researcher, I also see a lot of value in sort of being able to pull from all over the place instead of face-to-face.
Sure. Yeah, so on my position of more online, I think some of the hurdles are now, at least at my company, the convenience of online research is really powerful, and now that people are used to it, it's going to be harder and harder to get and coordinate everybody going back. Building on remote working is way up, and people are all over. It's just the investment in doing face-to-face research is high. The addiction to the speed of all the technology in MR is real, and I just see less face-to-face going forward.
And in a digital context, pants are optional.
I almost wore sweatpants today to make the point.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking the exact same thing about the addiction to the speed of online and the cost. You know, even if I, as a researcher, am, ready to get back to face-to-face, is are my clients ready to start buying plane tickets and meals again, in addition to just the cost of the research? So yes, it's more expensive, but I think there's also another side is, are respondents ready? And is there a selection bias between respondents who are ready to come to a focus group and respondents who are not? And does that potentially, skew your sample? So I'm ready. I don't know if the rest of the world is.
It's interesting about the skewing the sample. I haven't actually seen any data so far on that point, but I expect there would be some interesting academic papers.
We'll see. I mean, things are changing every day. I think people, looking at the amount of masking here, it's very clear, things are moving quickly, but, it is a very open question as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, super open question. And how we treat each other is really important too, like the social cues. I had, just at this, an hour ago, I had my agenda out on the table, and somebody else, which I'm a hugger, by the way, if you're wondering, and somebody else came up and looked through my agenda. I don't know the percent. It doesn't bother me that they did, by the way. But there might be some of you that were like, well, I'm gonna have to light the desk on fire, right? that just happened. And that's kind of the point, is that there's a lot of, it's almost like a new political point of view that you've got to start taking into consideration when you're in face-to-face. Like, what is the appropriate norm, framework for interacting with someone so you're not offensive on either side and inclusive? So, what are the differences in human behavior between virtual and in person? Ben, let's start with you.
So I think there's some really unique differences, and I guess it depends on the context of your saying. I think a lot of, and what I'm going to be talking about later, is some of the digital technology is pushing more towards individual responses versus group dynamics. And I do think there are positives to that. I think there are group dynamic biases that occur that, unless you're like super skilled moderator, which not everybody is, can't navigate. And I think the comfort level of folks of being in their own house or being in their own kitchen, and the nuances of context is so important in qualitative, and so I do think some of that new flexibility that technology enables really gives you sort of richer results.
Were there any surprises or benefits for you when you guys moved to digital besides cost savings?
Yeah, so I think one of the big ones, just building on sort of what I said before, is some of the learnings and the kind of responses we were getting when people were in an individual setting. So the comfort level people shared. I think there was definitely nervousness. I think one of the dynamics to talk about is sort of moderated versus unmoderated qual and feedback in those kinds of settings. And we were surprised by the richness and the depth we were getting from unmoderated. And even the point before about sort of letting people talk and telling their own stories, that was surprising. And I think it's making a big difference in how we continue to research.
Greg?
On the surprises? Yeah, I think one of the things that I was most, kind of an aha moment, or an oh shit moment, as we would say, for me, with, just kind of an online group, was the agility of the back room, which is something you don't get in a traditional, two-way glass or one-way glass scenario, where, we can be having a very active conversation in the virtual back room, and the moderator's kind of listening with one ear, the ability to feed questions forward, to update stimulus on the fly. We were looking at photos of various grocery stores, and one image had people in it, and that was distracting. So between groups, quick switch, done. You don't have to go get the damn thing printed. You don't have to worry about anything like that the way you used to in a non-virtual world. So I think the richness you get, and also when you have, additional clients and stakeholders in that virtual back room, they can be much more engaged, because it's not, okay, let's all figure out what we want to ask and write it on a Post-it note and hand it to the person and they go out in the hall. It's much more engaging because it's more dynamic and interactive.
Show of hands, how many of you have had notes passed to you while you're leading IDIs or focus groups? Right, super disruptive. Super disruptive. All right, go ahead. Let's just go down the line.
For me, I think it was the artifacts. I don't know about everyone else, but inevitably when I was doing in-person research, I would have these piles of Post-its and papers that I would inevitably get lost, or I'd spill pizza sauce on them or whatever, and then they would just sort of collected dust. Yeah, I'll get to them at some point. And then digital, I had videos which I could turn into GIFs, which made it really easy to socialize. I had, Miro boards that, it didn't matter if I moved it because the stickies wouldn't all sort of lose their sticky and then become absolutely useless. So there's a richness to artifacts, hilariously, in digital that I always just found really difficult to manage in person.
That's really interesting, but that's absolutely true. The content is naturally built for sharing.
Yeah.
I think one of the surprises for me, we touched a little bit on this, is just accessibility and harder to reach groups, and being able to, I've in a previous role had been doing a lot with multicultural research and understanding Hispanic shoppers and Asian shoppers, and being able to do that digitally, one, from a logistics standpoint, was much easier than trying to have multiple markets we were trying to visit to reach those groups. I think from a digital standpoint, being able to have just the moderator and the participant kind of having that experience and being in the back room and digitally not sort of showing myself and showing my identity, I think got to some really interesting insights and really interesting conversations where they didn't feel like they had to code switch as much just because of me being in the room or me being in that in-person environment. So I think that was an interesting surprise benefit from the digital world.
For the panelists, have any of you looked at the metadata in your video stuff? What I mean by that is you have the participant, but then you have all the stuff around them. Wow, that's a lot of shit. Or they have a really clean house. Or right? Is that ever come into play with the insights?
It's not something I've looked at formally, but definitely something that I'm constantly looking at people's Zoom backgrounds. And I think it's interesting sort of the curation that can kind of go on of either people blurring out their backgrounds and trying to have more of a buttoned up kind of appearance and trying to probe at what's kind of going on. I think just the early pandemic, having shirts sales going up but pants sales remaining flat or even going down, I think is sort of speaks to that, and just sort of how we kind of create that image of online and how we can kind of peel away some of those layers.
Anybody else?
The population I mostly work with are content creators, so bloggers, influencers, et cetera. So I learned it was always interesting to me who had nailed lighting and who was early on in their influencer journey, didn't have a ring light yet. And so that actually told me a lot about the sophistication of their content, which told me a lot about what tools they use. So it was interesting.
I don't know how I'm doing on time, so I might just need you to help me. Okay, thank you. So let's talk about going forward. As we look forward to the next 12 months, what does the ideal hybrid model look like for you? Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think my point of view is pretty clear. As I alluded to, I think the mix is going to go much heavier online. So, I mean, there is definitely a role for in-person. From a CPG perspective, I think, especially if you're in sort of a prototyping or a hands-on space, or you're iterating, I think there's all sorts of great creative ways to have groups of people come together and do really cool brainstorming, thought stuff. But right with and I'm going to spoil my own presentation pretty much, but the move to
don't do it.
The move to agile and the addiction to speed and the iteration and all that stuff. There's just such a new need and a use case for online that I could say with pretty significant confidence that our ways of working is going to skew heavy to online.
We'll just go down the line. Great.
Sure. I don't know. I mean, an ideal model, I think, I think it always depends on the research question, and I think that, all of us as researchers have to kind of develop a muscle memory for when is virtual appropriate, when is in-person appropriate. The same way we have that kind of, you've developed that sixth sense to just look at a base size and how many ways do I need to cut it and just kind of know that's not going to work or that feels right. To develop that sense, because the different modalities are going to be appropriate for different business questions, different different industries. So I think it's important for us to remember that face-to-face is an option and not always jump to the virtual answer, because, you know, if you're on the client side, you know, vendors are going to have very attractive offers in terms of price and speed and scale with online, and to not, you know, kind of be easily seduced by those ideas if face-to-face is going to be more valuable for the particular context.
Yeah, I mean, I think building off of what folks said, so I used to be a like face-to-face as much as possible. I hated online, and so I clocked crazy flight hours and time zone hopscotch and all that stuff. And then not having to do that for 2 years has felt amazing. Like, I have a life. It's shocking. I'm not burnt out. So, but I do think that particularly in that early exploration, messy, like what are we doing? How are we going to do this? Like, there is some inherent value in getting people in the room. So I'm like happy to fob off like every usability test from now on to an unmoderated study that I then just sort of watch some videos and call it a day. But for when there's like big questions and there's sort of like senior leadership involved in it, I'm going to want to, you know, have spent some actual time connecting with people in person.
Yeah, I guess in terms of a model, I don't know that there will be a true kind of model. I think it will depend, like Greg was saying, on the business question and the context in that decision-making moment, whether that's in person makes the most sense to answer that question versus virtual. I do think that there is a ton of momentum for virtual qual and digital qual, and we talked a little bit briefly about sort of the metaverse, and I'm more of a metaverse skeptic. I think, if anything, the last 2 years have shown that we do want that face-to-face interaction, and that moving our entire lives digitally just doesn't seem like anything that a lot of people will probably not do. But I think as more companies try to figure out that space, I think that will increase the ability of digital qual and other kind of that research technique to scale and be more cost effective. So I think that will be a consequence of people trying to get the metaverse to happen. I don't know if the metaverse is actually going to happen.
So digital qual is cheaper, and it's faster, and it's easier, right? So it's like building the perfect, for me, it's building the perfect, why would I want to go in person? But I got to tell you something, that like, you can't replace I don't know if it's biorhythms or hokey pokey, something going on, but like there is something that happens when you are hanging out with a participant and getting to know them. And it is a pain in the ass, because now I got to get on a flight and I got to work, you know, all these kinds, and it's much more expensive. But like, there's an oversized return that can be realized if you make the investment in the right context for in-person. Do any of you have stories about where you've had an oversized outcome for in-person?
I can speak to that a little bit. This goes way back to a previous life on the vendor side. We were doing some work for pharmaceutical company on an arthritis medication, and it was in-home interviews, and one of this particular medication came in its own kind of little dispenser. It was a pill, came in a, kind of a fancy little plastic dispenser. And one of the things we noticed, because this was in person, when we handed it to someone to just kind of react to it, they said, "Oh, this is never going to work." Why not? Because I can't open it with one hand, because this is an arthritis medication, and this person only had real dexterity in one hand. And a normal, amber vial pill bottle, they could kind of hold it and kind of twist it and open it with one hand. But this fancy thing that the company had spent all this money developing, you kind of needed to work it with two hands. And I don't know that you could have got that without being in the home and seeing how they actually interact with the world around them.
So right before my last in-person project, that was actually half in person and then half had to go remote, was understanding the future, like what is good beauty content. So I was based in London at the time, so I threw a posh dinner party in a private dining room in central London, invited women to come and had them bring their makeup bags. And so, over wine and tapas, we hung out, and I got to be the dumb guy. I was like, what is that thing, the eyelashy curly thing? How do you use it? And so like, in that case, you know how you mentioned earlier, like sometimes not having your subject position is really powerful. I totally like doubled down on like, I'm a stupid boy. But it was fun because like, as women were like rifling through their makeup bags and like pulling something out and being like, I don't leave the house without this ever. Tell me about that. How'd you learn about it? How'd you learn to apply it? Where'd you buy it? When'd you buy it? How'd you do the research for it? And so there was just this, and then like women went around the room, oh, I use that too, I love it, or, you know, and that kind of just organic, rich thing. Like I'm sure we've all watched a focus group on Zoom, like that just don't happen, right? Or it's much harder and takes much longer to do that rather than what was essentially a 2-hour cocktails thing with strangers.
Yeah, so for me, I had done back with McCormick when they went from tin cans to glass and then back to tin cans. If you even know the McCormick brand, right, of spice. And so I'm super old. This was in the 90s. When you tested glass as a you know, in the focus group facility, it's very well received because it's heavy and feels good. Whereas tin is it's tinny, right? I mean, it's literally got an association to it. And so there was this mistake that was made of the weight of the item is more important than the quality of the historical packaging. What we found in the research was that even though at that point in time, the people were more probable, they stated they would be more probable to purchase the glass container over the tin container. They didn't want to buy it, and the reason they didn't is because it wasn't what their grandma used. It wasn't the tin container and so there was this by just in the isolation of do you like this versus that, they like that, but would they actually wind up buying it? That was a completely different question for them, and they couldn't articulate that until we were in that in-person experience. So yeah, do we have time for questions, or am I way over and everybody's hungry? I see thumbs up. Where are we? We good? We have 15 minutes? Are there any questions for these awesome gentlemen? Or do you want to go eat? No? Really? Oh, one in the back.
One of the things that's happening with the pandemic is that we're all tired. I was reading a statistic. Prior to the pandemic, 11% of adults in the US reported mental health issues, not necessarily an illness, but a mental health problem. That's quadrupled in 2 years. For about 40% of US adults. Many of those are probably here, including myself. There's something that happens with QUAL research when you are doing everything online. I'm sure you've all turned off your cameras because you're sick of turning your cameras on calls. What's the panel's view on the burn down of your energy as a insights person that comes from watching groups or doing everything online? Because we now live in this environment that has gone online versus feeling that vibrancy, we're all frequencies. There's something that happens that's not spoken word or behavior, but we feel it.
Yeah, I mean, Zoom fatigue, I think is very real, and I think there's some published research on this idea of the exhaustion you feel knowing that when your camera is on, there's like 6 other people and any one of them could be staring at you and you have no way to know. So you kind of have to be always on. But I think that, for me, aside from just the general, being a professional in 2022 and that level of fatigue, I think one of the challenges working with virtual groups is remaining present. When you're in that back room, there are a lot of social pressures and it's right in front of you. It's harder to get distracted versus a virtual group when Amazon is a tab away, and you've heard this same kind of responses for the 4th or 5th time. So that is, I would say, can be more exhausting, or at least exhausting in a different way than a traditional backroom experience.
Anybody else point of view?
Yeah, I think the trying to find other ways to turn off the camera, and I've worked with Jorge for a number of years now, and the couple of like early pandemic phone calls that I had with the team, and like we were all cameras on, and then I eventually got to a point where I was like, guys, we can leave cameras off. It's okay. This is a safe space, and saving basically making the trade-off of having cameras on for when it really counts, and having it saving that energy for when you're engaging with participants or trying to build that relationship, but letting yourself turn off the camera and not be quite as on for when you don't need to be.
Last chance for questions? Yeah. Yep, got a couple coming up.
Hi, guys. Just a quick question. A lot of the stories that you cited, which were very interesting, had people doing real-life behavior, opening the pill bottle or cooking and things like that. How do you strike the balance, especially, I think one of you cited the fact that maybe participants don't want someone in their home or don't want to connect, to make that face-to-face research still be behavioral, even though you're the scientist in the room, so to speak?
Anyone have a point of view?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure follow the question. Would you mind? Sorry.
No, just saying that when you're doing face-to-face and you're in the room, there is this, someone could be reacting to the person asking the question, to the moderator. A lot of the stories that you said, like there's still a reason to do face-to-face, involved somebody in their natural environment doing something, part of their life. I'm just curious how you strike the balance of being there, and seeing them, but not influencing their behavior, especially.
And this is in the context of like more of ethnography, like you're in the home.
In the home, or going on a shop along. It's still face to face, right? We do a lot of those. So just curious how, especially post pandemic, where people are a bit more sensitive, how do you strike that balance of being there without influencing them?
I mean, you're gonna influence them.
Yeah.
Like, just that's the sort of foundational, thing of anthropology and sociology is being in the room. Like we're performative beings. So I think you just have to take that into account. Frankly, that's a crap answer. I'm aware.
Well, no, but it's the right answer though, right? Like it's that paradox of I'm doing my best to be invisible, but I also need to prompt you. And I mean, part of that is the skills of the moderator and building rapport and having a sense of when you're talking to someone and you get an answer and just kind of knowing like, I think that was a little bit bullshitty because I think they were saying that for me. They were, or not, and having that, it's a level of emotional intelligence, I think, to be able to sort out, what's a real answer versus something that might be a little more performative, and even understanding, I think that was a performative answer. Okay, why did they feel the need to be performative in that moment on that topic? What does that say about them, about the question?
I will say though, I think as well, because building off the earlier point of everyone's so tired, everyone's bullshit filter is kind of a little bit gone. So like I've noticed that like conversations I've had with participants get real, like at a very alarming rate where I'm like, whoa, I was asking you about your like dashboard preferences. You're telling me about infidelity in your marriage. Like, this is just like Homer Simpson retreating into the shrub, that gif. Like, so in some ways, I feel like because everyone's so tired, the performance is exhausting. And so you're at least able to sort of build rapport faster.
All right, I think we have one other question, didn't we? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Nice to see you, Jamin, not on a box on a screen. So just a couple things. On topics that are, let's say, a little bit more sensitive or emotionally charged, I find face-to-face is far superior because on a Zoom platform, people tend to think asynchronously. They wait for the other person to finish their thought or complete their thought. And there's less opportunity to build off of those little nuggets and insights that you get from the other people that are participating. So that is I think continues to be a big deficiency of the online version of qualitative. I'm not talking ethnography, I'm talking about either IDIs, mini groups, full groups, however you want to call them. And then the other thing is, I find when I'm doing larger groups, there are little alliances that form between members of the group. It could be two women, two men, age group, whatever. And that gives them permission to open up about a topic or an issue that they might not have otherwise had the courage to mention in a group setting. So if they find another like-minded person saying these things, it's a lot easier for them to start opening up about their experiences and their emotions and their feelings and so on and so forth. So I think there's a place for both, and I think it's up to the researcher and the client ultimately to decide which of those two options is best suited for the marketing decision, the business decision, et cetera. Thanks.
It's a great point of view. Very good point of view. And I think we're at time? 5 minutes. Oh, thanks so much for that. Any other questions? All right, yes.
It's kind of in the similar topic. I am a big fan of online, and I was trying to convince clients for years before the pandemic about the benefits of online. And I'm thankful about the pandemic because finally they realized that we can do a lot of things virtually. But I do think that there are some differences regarding the methodologies that we're using. IDIs work very well virtually. Focus groups, and to your point, sometimes work well, but sometimes are not that good. Like one of the things that I believe is that we cannot have more than 4 participants in an online group. 6, I have tried it, I hate it. And the other thing is that the length. More than 1 hour, they get distracted. That's been my experience. What is your perspective about that, thinking about focus groups specifically, online versus face-to-face?
I'll go first, I guess. I agree. Like focus groups they're tricky. Like you do them because sometimes you have no choice. But I think more than 4, it gets messy. It gets hard. And as well with some topics, like I remember when I did a medical adherence study with people in end-stage melanoma, I could not imagine talking to someone who was dying over Zoom about why they're not taking their medication because they're dying. Like I just couldn't imagine having that conversation in any robust, real way. So I have found that as much as possible, just veer away from focus groups in the last 2 years because, one, even like focus groups in sort of the before time, in a facility, like I don't know how much I put stock in them. And 2, it can just be logistical chaos, and there's so much that's missing. Like when two people gang up in a focus, I love that. I like stack the deck to make that happen, right? Because I want to see alliances. It's going to get top model Survivor. Like let's do it. And so with none of that human quirky richness, so then you're just a whole bunch of people on a meeting. Like I do that 8 hours a day already. Like why would I want to do that again, right? Yeah, I agree.
And I think that part of it, like, we kind of landed on, 6 to 8 people up to 2 hours as a, like, focus group standard. We kind of landed on that after decades of hundreds of thousands of researchers doing it. But I think, this online focus groups as, like, your main method of focus groups is very new. We're still figuring it out. We don't necessarily know what the right length, what the right number of respondents are, what the best practices are. It's still very up in the air for a lot of us. So, I think that, there's a lot of learning left to be done before we get to that same level that we get from the older methods.
Yeah, I think so. I haven't done a lot of the online focus groups in the last 2 years, specifically because of some of the challenges we just talked about. I think it is an opportunity for boards, online sort of asynchronous discussion, because I still think you get some of that participant interaction with each other, but people have more of a chance to kind of craft their thoughts and and just the things that people are willing to share online and writing is wild, kind of to Marcus's point, just put it all out there. And so I think that is a way that we've tried to get around that of like everyone sort of talking over each other and sort of that meeting context and having more of that asynchronous but also moderated through the boards as well.
Thank you.
I think it also raises like a bigger discussion on the role of focus groups versus IDIs and the pros and cons of each. And I think technology has solved a lot of the cons of IDIs to the point where I don't know that the value of focus groups is even there in a digital world anymore, except for very specific use cases where like, hey, if it was all end size and the people you're going to and getting up, like I can do 20 IDIs now, like very quickly. So to me, I concur with your thoughts about focus groups of 6, and I would say focus groups online in general. Like I don't see them being as important in the future.
Final thoughts on the topic. So what has got us to where we are right now is not going to carry us into the future. As you think about the framework of focus groups, which really hit scale in the 50s, it didn't go through any iteration through the 90s and 2000s. It pretty much looked exactly the same. And it is we now have an opportunity to completely recraft what that looks like. And in a context where world, according to Microsoft, the average attention span is around 8 seconds, which is less than a hummingbird. What are we talking about? And right, and I mean, we've got to be thinking about like our research in the context of the other options that the consumer has access to and the level of entertainment and engagement and reward that they're going to get from that. So I have a son, he drives for Uber Eats occasionally when he wants to make a little side cash. And if I want him to take a 15-minute survey, he's immediately thinking about the ROI against that. Is that a good trade-off for him on his time? Well, the answer is no, it's not in the current framework, right? And so we've really got to be thinking about, especially if we're going to connect with Gen Z, XYZ, yeah. And if we're going to connect with Gen Alpha later on, which all of us need to be thinking about if you're on the brand side. I mean, it's like a wild, wild west in terms of what what we look like as human beings and how we interact with research and the methodologies and the tools and making sure that we use the right things at the right time. Because what we don't want to do as researchers is fall into the trap today of everything is a nail to a hammer, right? And that is you will F your life up as a researcher because you're going to immediately think, oh, I've got this tool to fit that because I do it like that all the time. We need to continue to have the creativity in how we approach research, especially in qualitative framework. And I'm the moderator, so that's the end of the story. Big round of applause for our guests. Thank you guys. Good job.